The heavy oak doors of the community center auditorium creaked open, letting in a wave of damp afternoon air that did little to cool the stuffy room inside. It was the kind of place that smelled faintly of floor wax, old paper, and the anxious sweat of dozens of children. The annual spring piano recital was a tradition in the small town. A formal event where parents dressed in their Sunday best to watch their children perform pieces that ranged from clunky, beginner scales to surprisingly complex sonatas 7-year-old. Anya sat on a hard metal folding chair in the very front row. Her feet, dangling a few inches above the floor, swung back and forth in a nervous rhythm. She was small for her age, with wide brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. While most of the other children were chatting excitedly or frantically reviewing their sheet music, Anya sat quiet and still. She was clutching a wrinkled piece of paper in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. But for Anya, it was heavier than just stage fright. Her family had fallen on hard times recently. Her father had lost his job at the factory months ago. Money was so tight that buying groceries was often more important than fixing the hole in her shoe. The dress she was wearing was a hand-me-down from her older cousin, a bit too long in the sleeves and slightly faded from years of washing. It was clean and pressed, thanks to her mother's late-night efforts. But Anya couldn't help but notice the crisp, new outfits the other girls were wearing. To her right sat a girl named Tiffany, whose sparkly blue dress looked like it had just come from a department store that morning. Tiffany was laughing loudly, showing off a new bracelet to her friends. Anya looked down at her own lap, feeling a familiar knot of shame tighten in her stomach. It wasn't just the clothes, though. It was the piano. Anya loved music more than anything in the world. At home, tucked away in the corner of their small living room, sat an ancient upright piano that had been rescued from a thrift store. It was out of tune, and some of the ivory keys were chipped, revealing the dark wood underneath. But to Anya, it was a treasure chest. Every day after school, while her parents worried about bills, she would sit at that old instrument and lose herself in the sounds. She didn't just read the notes. She felt them. She would listen to songs on the radio and then try to figure them out on the dusty keys, teaching herself by ear because her family couldn't afford expensive private lessons. Finally, her mother had managed to save enough for a few months of lessons with the local teacher, a stern woman named Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling was known in the town for being strict and for having very high standards. She was also known for preferring students who came from respectable families, who could afford the best instruments and the fanciest recital fees. Mrs. Sterling walked down the aisle now, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. She wore a severe black suit and carried a clipboard like a weapon. She stopped in front of the row of waiting students, her eyes scanning the line. When she got to Anya, she paused. Mrs. Sterling didn't smile. "Anya," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Do you have your music?" "Yes, Mrs. Sterling," Anya whispered. Holding up the crumpled paper, Mrs. Sterling sighed, a long, exaggerated sound that made Tiffany and the other girls giggle. "I see you've treated your sheet music with the same level of discipline as your practice schedule. I hope you know that wrinkles on the paper lead to wrinkles in the music." The giggles grew louder. Anya felt her face get hot. She wanted to disappear into the chair. She had practiced. She had practiced until her fingers were sore, late into the night when the house was quiet. But Mrs. Sterling didn't like that Anya played by feeling instead of sticking rigidly to the rules. The teacher had told her mother just last week that Anya lacked focus and was wasting her time. "Sit up straight, all of you," Mrs. Sterling commanded, turning her attention to the group. "Remember, you are representing my studio. I do not want to see any slouching, any mistakes, or any foolishness." One by one, the students were called up to the stage. The stage was just a raised wooden platform with a single grand piano in the center, shiny and black under the bright lights. Anya watched as Tiffany went up first. Tiffany played a piece by Mozart. It was fast and difficult, and she played every note perfectly, her fingers flying across the keys like little birds. When she finished, the audience clapped politely. Mrs. Sterling nodded approvingly from the side of the stage. Other students followed. A boy in a suit played a jazzy piece that made people tap their feet. A girl with curly hair played a sad, slow song that was very pretty. They were all good. They were all polished. They all looked like they belonged there then. It was Anya's turn. "Anya," Mrs. Sterling's voice boomed over the microphone. She was standing at the podium now. "You are next." Anya stood up. Her legs felt like jelly. She smoothed down the front of her faded dress and walked toward the stage steps. The auditorium seemed huge. The lights were blindingly bright, making it hard to see the faces of the people sitting in the rows beyond the front. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. She climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under her light shoes, and walked over to the massive piano. It looked much bigger than the one at home. She sat down on the bench. It was smooth leather, cold against the back of her legs. She adjusted the bench, trying to find the right height, just like she practiced. She placed her crumpled sheet music on the rack. Mrs. Sterling stepped back up to the microphone. But instead of announcing the name of the song and stepping back into the shadows, she lingered. She looked out at the audience with a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice echoing slightly, "our next performer is a student who has a unique approach to the piano. Anya has decided to attempt a piece that is usually reserved for students much older and more experienced than she is." The audience murmured. A few people leaned forward in their seats. "Now, we must remember that music is about discipline," Mrs. Sterling continued, her eyes fixed on Anya, who sat frozen on the bench. "Sometimes, enthusiasm is not enough. Talent without training can often lead to a messy result. I ask for your patience during this next performance." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. It wasn't mean laughter, but the laughter of adults who thought they were in on a joke. They thought they were about to watch a cute little girl try her best and fail. Anya stared at the black and white keys in front of her. She could hear Mrs. Sterling's words ringing in her ears. Asterisk, messy result. Enthusiasm is not enough. Asterisk, she looked out into the blinding lights, searching for her parents. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there. She knew her mother was probably gripping her father's hand, holding her breath. She knew how much they had sacrificed to get her here. Mrs. Sterling walked over to the piano. Leaning down close to Anya, the teacher's perfume smelled like strong flowers. "Don't disappoint them, dear," she whispered, her voice low enough that only Anya could hear. "Just try to keep the rhythm. If you get lost, just stop playing. Don't force it." Anya's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt small. She felt the shame of her worn dress, the shame of the wrinkled music, and the weight of the teacher's disapproval pressing down on her shoulders. This was supposed to be a dream, a chance to show everyone what she could do, but it felt like a trap. She looked at the sheet music Mrs. Sterling had given her. It was a simple nursery rhyme, a song for babies. Anya knew that if she played that song, she would be safe. She wouldn't make any big mistakes. But she also knew that Mrs. Sterling would smirk. The teacher would look at the audience and say, "See? I told you she wasn't ready." Anya took a deep breath. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. The room was completely silent, waiting for the first note. The air was thick with expectation. Anya closed her eyes for just a second. She thought about the old piano at home, the chipped keys, and the way the music made her feel when no one was watching. She realized that playing it safe wouldn't prove anything. The only way to survive this moment was to be herself, no matter what Mrs. Sterling said. She opened her eyes and took her hands off the simple nursery rhyme music. Instead, she pushed the paper aside. She straightened her back, placed her fingers on the keys, and prepared to play the song that had been living in her heart for months. A hush fell over the crowded auditorium, but it wasn't the respectful silence that usually greets a performer. It was a tense, waiting quiet like the air just before a storm. Everyone in the room had heard Mrs. Sterling's introduction. They were expecting a spectacle, or at the very least, a cute but clumsy failure. The audience members settled back into their seats, some with sympathetic smiles, others with raised eyebrows. Ready to watch the little girl in the faded dress struggle, Anya sat frozen on the bench. The black and white keys of the grand piano stretched out before her like a long, endless road. To her right, the sheet music for the simple nursery rhyme sat forgotten. She didn't want to play it. She knew that if she played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, she would be confirming everything Mrs. Sterling believed about her, that she was small, poor, and untalented. But the fear was a heavy weight in her stomach. If she played what she really wanted to play, complicated piece she had taught herself on the old broken piano at home, she might mess up. She might fall on her face in front of everyone. Mrs. Sterling was still standing near the piano. She hadn't walked away to the side of the stage like she had for the other students. Instead, she stood just a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. Her presence was looming and dark. She was watching Anya like a hawk, waiting for the first mistake so she could step in, perhaps stop the music, and scold her in front of everyone. "Whenever you're ready?" "Anya," Mrs. Sterling said loudly into the silence. Her voice was sharp, lacking any warmth. It wasn't an encouragement. It was a command to hurry up. Anya's hands hovered over the keys. They felt cold and clammy. She looked out into the blur of the audience. She couldn't see her parents clearly because of the bright stage lights, but she knew they were out there. She thought about her father's tired smile when he came home from looking for work, and how her mother would hum while she cooked dinner. They believed in her. Mrs. Sterling didn't, but her parents did. That thought gave her a tiny spark of courage, just enough to warm her freezing fingers. She took a shaky breath and decided. She was not going to play the nursery rhyme. She was going to play the music that lived inside her head. The first chord Anya struck was not the quiet, tentative plinking of a beginner. It was loud. It was a deep, resonant C minor chord that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into the bench. The sound was rich and full, filling the entire hall instantly. Mrs. Sterling flinched visibly. She uncrossed her arms and took a step closer to the piano, a look of annoyance flashing across her face. She leaned forward, hissing through her teeth so the front row could hear. "Anya, that is not the piece. You are playing too aggressively. Soften it down right now." Usually a student would have stopped. A student would have been terrified by the teacher hissing at them to stop. But as soon as Anya's fingers hit that first chord, something changed inside her. The nerves that had been twisting her stomach into knots suddenly unraveled. The music took over. It was like a door had opened, and she wasn't Anya, the poor student, anymore. She was just a musician. She ignored Mrs. Sterling. She didn't look up. She just kept playing. The piece she had chosen was fast and complicated. It was a piece by a composer named Chopin that she had heard on a classical radio station. It required her left hand to jump up and down the lower keys, while her right hand played a cascade of quick, flowing notes. Her fingers, which had been trembling a moment ago, suddenly knew exactly where to go. Mrs. Sterling's annoyance quickly turned to shock. Her mouth opened slightly as she watched Anya's hands move. This wasn't the clumsy fumbling she had predicted. Anya was hitting the right notes. Her timing was precise. "You need to stop," Mrs. Sterling whispered sternly, stepping right up to the side of the piano, blocking the view of some of the audience. "You are deviating from the program. This is unacceptable." Anya was in a world of her own now. She couldn't hear the whispers. She couldn't see the teacher standing over her. She only heard the melody. It was soaring and crashing like waves on the ocean. She remembered the old piano at home, the one with the sticky keys. On that piano, she had to hit the keys hard to get a sound out. Here, on this perfect grand piano, her lightest touch produced a beautiful, singing tone. The audience, which had been ready for a disaster, was now completely still. The man in the third row who had been checking his watch stopped looking and sat up. The woman in the front row, who had been whispering to her neighbor, turned her head and stared at the stage with wide eyes. The sound coming from the stage was not what they expected. It was filled with a raw, powerful emotion that didn't seem possible for a 7-year-old. Mrs. Sterling, however, was not listening to the beauty. She was only thinking about her control. She was a teacher who demanded obedience. The fact that this little girl was ignoring her direct order to stop was making her angry. She didn't care how well it sounded. She cared that she was being disrespected in front of the parents and the other students. "Anya," Mrs. Sterling barked, this time loud enough for the microphone to pick up a slight echo. I said, "Stop this instant." The interruption hung in the air for a split second. Anya hit a complicated run of notes, a fast stream of sound that required total focus. For a moment, Mrs. Sterling's voice threatened to break her concentration. Her fingers stuttered for just a heartbeat on one key, producing a slightly jarring sound. A few people in the audience gasped, thinking the crash was coming. Anya's heart skipped a beat. The shame flashed in her mind again. *C, you can't do it. You're going to fail. But then, her muscle memory took over. Her left hand slammed down the next bass note to cover the mistake, and her right hand surged forward into the next phrase of the song. It was louder now. She wasn't playing softly anymore. She was playing with a fierce determination, pouring all her frustration, all her loneliness, and all her anger into the keys. The sound swelled. It was aggressive, yes, but it was also breathtaking. It was the sound of someone fighting to be heard. Mrs. Sterling took a step back. The sheer volume and intensity of the music were actually pushing her back. She looked at Anya's face. The little girl wasn't looking at the keys. Her head was tilted slightly back, her eyes closed. An expression of pure concentration and fierce joy on her face. Mrs. Sterling realized with a sinking feeling that she couldn't stop her without physically grabbing her hands, which would be a disaster. The teacher looked out at the audience. The mood had shifted completely. The sympathetic smiles were gone. The people were on the edge of their seats. They were witnessing something extraordinary. Mrs. Sterling felt a cold knot of fear in her own stomach. She had tried to humiliate this child to prove a point about discipline. But the child was proving her own talent to be bigger than the teacher's pettiness. Anya played on. She was approaching the hardest part of the song, a section where the music slowed down and became very soft, delicate, and fragile. It required a gentle touch that was hard for even professionals to master. She slowed her hands. The loud, crashing waves of music settled into a gentle, trickling stream. The contrast was dramatic. The auditorium was so quiet now that you could hear the air conditioning humming. Anya's small fingers danced lightly over the keys, playing a whisper-soft melody that felt like a lullaby. It was beautiful. It was haunting. Mrs. Sterling stood frozen by the piano, her face pale. She looked down at the clipboard in her hand. Then at the little girl who was ignoring her, completely lost in the magic of the music. The teacher knew she had lost control. She wasn't the most important person in the room anymore. The little girl in the faded dress was. The delicate melody drifted through the air like smoke, wrapping around the people in the front rows. Anya's fingers moved with a gentleness that contradicted the strength she had shown just moments before. This was the hardest part of the piece, not because the notes were difficult to reach, but because they required perfect control. She had to make the piano sing without hitting the keys hard enough to make them sound. Harsh, Mrs. Sterling stood rooted to the spot beside the piano. Her plan had crumbled. She had expected the girl to crumble under pressure, to play a few wrong notes, get confused, and start crying. Then Mrs. Sterling could step in, look like the benevolent expert, and guide the poor child off the stage. That wasn't happening. Instead, the little girl was navigating the instrument with a mastery that Mrs. Sterling had never seen in a student so young. It was infuriating, and yet the teacher found she couldn't look away. Anya's hands were small. They stretched across the keys with an elegant confidence. On her old battered piano at home, she had to pound the keys just to hear them over the noises of the street. Here, she learned that a touch as light as a feather could produce a sound that carried to the back of the room. She was playing a song about a storm and the calm that comes after it. She knew this feeling. She knew it from the nights she sat in the dark living room, listening to her parents whisper in the kitchen. Worrying about money, worrying about the future. The music was her way of telling that storm that it wouldn't win. She missed a nota, tiny, sharp blip in the melody. It wasn't enough to ruin the song, but to a trained ear like Mrs. Sterling's, it was obvious. The teacher saw it immediately. Her eyebrows shot up, and she saw a chance to regain her authority. "Anya, watch your timing," Mrs. Sterling snapped, her voice sharp and loud, breaking the spell of the music. It was a calculated move. She wanted to startle the girl, to make her falter again, to prove that she needed a teacher to correct her. The sound of Mrs. Sterling's voice cut through the air like a knife. People in the audience shifted in their seats, annoyed by the interruption. They were lost in the music, and the teacher's outburst felt like someone talking loudly in a library. Anya didn't stop. She didn't even flinch visibly. It was as if she had built a glass wall around herself. Inside that wall, there was only her and the piano. The outside world, with its judgmental teachers, its expectations, and its cruelty, could not touch her. When the sharp voice came, she simply imagined a loud crash of thunder in the middle of her song, and she let her left hand play a heavy, low chord to drown it out. The vibration of the piano shook her bench, and she surged forward into the final, triumphant section of the piece. Mrs. Sterling took a step back, genuinely shocked. She had never been ignored like this. Her power came from her students' fear of her. Without that fear, she felt helpless. She looked out at the audience, hoping to see them confused or annoyed by the disruption. Instead, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The people were leaning forward. Their faces were soft. Some had closed their eyes. They were no longer judging the girl. They were connecting with her. They were hearing the stories she was telling with the keys. A father in the third row wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. A grandmother in the back stopped knitting to listen. Anya's talent was doing something that Mrs. Sterling's strict discipline could never do. It was making people feel something real. The little girl's hands were moving faster now. A blur of motion. The intensity was rising again. She was pouring everything she had into the performance. The sweat on her forehead was ignored. The stiffness in her shoulders from the tension was forgotten. She was fighting. Every note was a punch against the idea that she wasn't good enough. Every run of her fingers was a sprint away from the life she didn't want, as the music built toward its climax. Mrs. Sterling realized with a sinking feeling in her stomach that she was becoming the villain of this story. She looked at Anya's mother, whom she recognized from the payment struggles. The woman was sitting on the edge of her chair, her hands pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't looking at Mrs. Sterling with gratitude. She was looking at her daughter with overwhelming pride and a touch of defiance. Mrs. Sterling had tried to humiliate this family to make a point about excellence, and now the family was rising above her. Shining in the light of their daughter's courage, Anya reached the final sequence. It was a series of powerful rolling chords that demanded the full strength of her arms. She stood up slightly on the bench to get the leverage she needed, her small frame lifting off the leather seat. She brought her hands down hard on the keys. Bam! The sound was enormous. It echoed off the high ceiling of the community center. It was a sound of victory then, silence. Anya held the final pose, her hands hovering over the keys, her chest heaving with exertion. She kept her eyes closed for just a second longer, letting the silence stretch, letting the sound hang in the air. For what felt like a long time, no one moved. The audience was frozen. Mrs. Sterling was frozen. It was the kind of silence that happens when something profound has just occurred. When the ordinary world has been cracked open to reveal something magic, Mrs. Sterling opened her mouth to say something. To critique the performance, or to cut it short with a dismissive thank you. But before she could make a sound, the room exploded. It started with one person clapping a slow, rhythmic clap from the back of the room. Then, another person joined in. Within seconds, it became a roar. The silence shattered into a massive wave of applause and cheers. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was loud, raucous approval. People stood up. They whistled. They shouted bravo. Anya opened her eyes, blinking against the bright lights. She looked out into the sea of people. They were standing. They were smiling. They were clapping for her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel poor. She felt like she was 10 feet tall. She slid off the piano bench and dropped into a clumsy, hurried curtsy, just like she had practiced. But when she straightened up, she didn't look at Mrs. Sterling. She looked out at the blur of faces, searching for her parents. She found them in the front row. Her mother was crying and clapping so hard her hands must have stung. Her father was beaming, his face lit up with a pride Anya had rarely seen. On the stage, Mrs. Sterling stood in the shadows near the curtain. She stared at the scene in front of her face pale and unreadable. The applause washed over her, but it wasn't for her. It was for the little girl she had tried to shame. The teacher realized, with a heavy, sinking heart, that the girl's talent was real, and that her own attempt to break that spirit had only made it shine brighter. The room was full of joy and celebration, but for Mrs. Sterling, the recital had turned into a lesson she never expected to learn. One taught to her by a 7-year-old girl in a faded dress. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wave of sound that bounced off the high ceiling of the community hall and seemed to shake the very dust from the rafters. Anya stood in the center of the stage, blinking rapidly as the blinding stage lights reflected off the polished black piano. Her chest heaved with every breath, her small body trembling not from fear, but from the sudden rush of adrenaline that comes after a moment of pure release. She had done it. She had survived the storm. For a few seconds, she just stood there, frozen like a deer in headlights. The noise was overwhelming. People were standing up, whistling and stomping their feet. It was chaotic and loud and wonderful. Anya looked toward the side of the stage where Mrs. Sterling was standing, half hidden in the heavy red curtains. She expected the teacher to step forward, to take a bow, or perhaps to finally smile and tell her she did a good job. That was how it worked, wasn't it? The teacher led the student, and they shared the success, but Mrs. Sterling didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her stomach. Her face was a mask of tight, pale skin. She wasn't looking at the audience. She was looking at Anya with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't happiness. It was shock. It was the look of someone who had just watched a small bird lift a car. She seemed smaller now, less imposing. The scary aura that usually surrounded her had vanished, replaced by a confusing vulnerability. Anya looked away, feeling a sudden pang of awkwardness. She realized that Mrs. Sterling wasn't going to help her. She was on her own up here. So Anya did what she had seen the other students do. She gave a small, shy curtsy, grasping the sides of her faded dress and bending her knees. When she stood back up, the applause got even louder. A man in the 5th row shouted, "More? Play another one." A few others joined in, clapping in a rhythmic chant. Anya shook her head frantically, her loose hair flying across her face. She didn't have another song. She had given everything she had in that one performance. She just wanted to find her mother. She hurried off the stage, her shoes scuffing slightly against the wooden floor. As she passed Mrs. Sterling, she slowed down, instinctively waiting for a comment. She braced herself for a whisper of "You were lucky," or "That was entirely inappropriate." Mrs. Sterling stared at her. The older woman's lips pressed together into a thin, white line. Her eyes darted from Anya to the audience, who were still clapping and looking toward the stage, hoping the little girl would come back out. Finally, Mrs. Sterling seemed to deflate, like a balloon losing air. She stepped back, making room for Anya to pass, and said nothing. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a nod. She just stepped aside, letting the girl walk past her into the safety of the wings. Once backstage, the noise from the auditorium was muffled, but the vibration could still be felt in the floorboards. It was darker here, and cooler. Anya leaned against a heavy velvet curtain and let out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were still tingling, as if the piano keys were vibrating under her skin. "Anya," her mother's voice cut through the dimness. Before Anya could turn, she was swept up in a tight embrace. Her mother was crying, laughing, and smelling of talcum powder and the familiar scent of home. She squeezed Anya so hard it almost hurt, but Anya didn't pull away. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder, feeling the tears soaking through her own blouse. "You were amazing," her mother whispered, her voice cracking. "You were absolutely amazing. I couldn't breathe. I was so scared, and then you started playing and I couldn't breathe again." Her father was there too. He was a quiet man, usually tired from long days of looking for work, but now his eyes were bright and wet. He put a large, rough hand on top of Anya's head. "I never knew you could do that," he said softly, a look of wonder on his face. "I knew you liked the piano, but Anya, that was magic." "It wasn't magic, Dad," Anya mumbled into her mother's coat. "I just didn't want Mrs. Sterling to win." "She didn't win," her father said firmly. "Not tonight." Back in the main hall, the applause was finally starting to die down. Mrs. Sterling walked back to the center of the stage. She felt dizzy. She adjusted her glasses, trying to compose herself. She looked out at the crowd. The faces that had been smiling and cheering a moment ago were now looking at her with expectation. They wanted the next performer. They wanted to move on, but the mood had changed. Before, the audience was a collection of strangers judging children. Now, they felt like a community that had witnessed something special. They were no longer interested in the polite, robotic performances of the other students. They'd seen raw emotion, and that was what they wanted. Mrs. Sterling cleared her throat into the microphone. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding thin and strained. "That was certainly a unique interpretation. We will now move on to the next student, Tiffany." Tiffany walked up the stairs, looking glamorous in her sparkly dress. She smiled at the audience, expecting the same warm reception she had received earlier. She sat down and began to play her second piece, a lively, upbeat song. She played it perfectly. Every note was in the right place. Her technique was flawless, but the audience didn't cheer. They clapped politely when she finished, but the energy was gone. The magic had left the stage. Anya's performance had been like a lightning strike, electric, dangerous, and alive. Tiffany's playing, while correct, felt like a battery-operated toy in comparison. The people in the seats shifted restlessly. They whispered to each other, "Did you see that little girl's face? I've never heard a child play like that. Who is she?" Whispers spread through the room like ripples in a pond. People were asking about Anya. They were asking about her family. They were ignoring the teacher's carefully planned schedule. A man in a sharp gray suit, who had been sitting near the back, stood up. He didn't look like the other parents. He looked important. He walked down the aisle and stopped near the side door where Anya and her family were gathering. He was looking at a program, frowning. "Excuse me," the man said, tapping a woman on the shoulder. "Do you know who that little girl was?" "The one in the blue dress. The one who played the Chopin?" The woman nodded enthusiastically. "That's Anya. She lives in the apartment buildings on Elm Street. Her mother works at the laundry." The man nodded, making a note on a small card. He had a thoughtful expression on his face. He had been a judge for music competitions for 20 years, and he had never seen anything like it. That child didn't just play the notes. She understood the language of the music. She had a gift that couldn't be taught and certainly couldn't be shamed. Backstage, Anya was drinking a cup of water that her father had brought her. Her hands had stopped shaking, and a warm glow was spreading through her chest. She watched the other students go by. Some of them ignored her, but others stopped. Tiffany came off the stage, looking grumpy. Her mother was with her, fussing with her hair. Tiffany spotted Anya standing by the curtain. For a second, the older girl looked mean, but then she hesitated. She remembered how Anya had played. She remembered the sound that had filled the room. Tiffany walked over to Anya. Her hands were clasped behind her back. "That was hard," Tiffany said quietly. Anya looked up, surprised. "What was?" "That piece you played. My mom tried to get me to learn it last year, but I couldn't do it. It was too hard," Anya just shrugged. "I liked how it sounded." Tiffany looked at Anya for a long moment, then looked down at her own shiny shoes. "You were really good," she mumbled, almost too quiet to hear. Then she turned and walked away before anyone could see her blushing. Anya smiled. It was a small victory, but it felt good. She realized that she hadn't just stunned the room with her talent. She had changed something inside the people who heard her. She had shown them that even a little girl with a faded dress and an old piano could create something beautiful. Mrs. Sterling was still on stage, introducing the next student. She looked stiff and uncomfortable. The recital was going on, but the heart of the evening was gone. The heart was standing backstage, wearing a simple dress, holding her father's hand, ready to go home. The heavy wooden doors of the community center swung open, letting in the cool, fresh air of the evening. Anya stepped outside, her father's hand warm and large in hers. The noise of the recital, the polite clapping, the hushed whispers. The sharp voice of Mrs. Sterling, calling out names, faded behind them as they walked into the quiet street. Anya felt like she was walking on air. Her body was tired, but her spirit was lighter than it had ever been. The crowd from the recital was slowly spilling out onto the sidewalk. Parents were buttoning coats and gathering their children. Anya tightened her grip on her father's hand, bracing herself for the reaction. Usually when people looked at her, they saw the girl with the second-hand clothes. She was used to being invisible, or worse, being looked at with pity. But tonight, eyes followed her as she walked down the path. People stopped talking to watch her pass. A woman in a red coat, who had been sitting near the front, stepped in front of them. Anya's father instinctively pulled Anya behind him, thinking they were in the way. "I'm sorry, excuse us," he said politely. "No, wait," the woman said. She had a kind face, and her eyes were shining. She looked down at Anya. "I just wanted to tell you that was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. You have a special gift, sweetheart." Anya blinked, surprised. Before she could say thank you, a man standing nearby chimed in. "She's right. I've been coming to these recitals for years, and I've never heard anything like that. You stunned us all." Anya's mother, who was walking beside them, put a hand over her heart. She looked at her daughter with a mixture of relief and overflowing pride. Her father stood a little taller. The shame of their financial situation, which usually felt like a heavy coat they had to wear, seemed to disappear. In the eyes of these strangers, they weren't the poor family from the apartments. They were the family of the talented girl. A few moments later, the man in the gray suit, the one who had been asking questions about Anya backstage, approached them. He moved with an easy confidence. He stopped a few feet away and offered his hand to Anya's father. "My name is Mr. Victor," he said. "I'm the director of the City Youth Symphony." Anya's father shook his hand hesitantly, not sure what to expect. "It is nice to meet you, sir. This is my daughter, Anya." Mr. Victor smiled and crouched down so he was eye level with Anya. He didn't talk down to her like a baby. He looked at her with respect. "Anya, I was very impressed with your performance tonight. You have a rare ability to feel the music, not just play the notes. It takes most musicians years to learn what you did naturally today." "Thank you," Anya whispered. "I run a special program for young musicians," Mr. Victor continued. "We provide lessons, instruments, and mentoring to students who show great promise. It is a scholarship program. There is no cost to the family. I would be honored if you would come and audition for us. If you play half as well as you did tonight, I have a feeling you will be leading our orchestra one day." Anya's parents exchanged a look. It was too good to be true. A scholarship? Free lessons? A real opportunity? Her mother's eyes filled with tears again. "Sir, we don't have much money, but she works hard," her mother said, her voice trembling. "She loves that old piano we have." "Hard work and love are exactly what I'm looking for," Mr. Victor said firmly. He handed a card to Anya's father. "Call me on Monday. We will get her set up with a proper teacher." They said their goodbyes, and the Victor family walked toward their car. Anya watched them go, then looked up at her parents. "Is this real?" she asked. Her father scooped her up into his arms, hugging her tight. "It's real, princess. It's very real." Behind them, the side door of the community center opened again. Mrs. Sterling stepped out. She looked tired and flustered. She was holding a box of leftover programs and a stack of sheet music. She spotted Anya and her family near the bottom of the stairs. For a moment, Mrs. Sterling looked like she wanted to keep walking, to get to her car and drive away. But then she stopped. She looked at Anya, and for the first time, she really saw her. She didn't see a disobedient student or a messy little girl. She saw a talent that she had failed to nurture, a spark that she had tried to snuff out but which burned brighter than ever. Slowly, Mrs. Sterling walked over to them. Anya's father stepped slightly in front of Anya, protective instinct kicking in. Mrs. Sterling noticed this and stopped a few feet away. "I heard," Mrs. Sterling said quietly. Her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. She looked at the ground for a moment, then back up at Anya. Mr. Victor is a very important man. He knows talent. If he offers you a place in his program, you should take it." "I didn't mean to disobey you," Anya said softly. Mrs. Sterling let out a long sigh. She adjusted her glasses. "I tried to teach you discipline, Anya. I thought I was preparing you for the reality of how hard music is. But I was wrong." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "I tried to shame you because I thought you were being arrogant. But you weren't arrogant. You were ready. You were more ready than I gave you credit for." It wasn't a perfect apology. But for Mrs. Sterling, it was a mountain of humility. Anya saw the older woman in a different light, not as a monster, but as someone who was too afraid to let people be different. "I played what was in my heart," Anya said simply. Mrs. Sterling nodded, a faint, almost sad smile touching her lips. "Yes, you did. And that is something I cannot teach. I can teach you where to put your fingers, Anya, but I cannot teach you how to put your soul into the music. You have that naturally. Don't ever let anyone take that away from you." She turned to Anya's parents. "She is gifted. Don't let her stop playing." With that, Mrs. Sterling gave a stiff nod, turned on her heel, and walked toward the parking lot. Anya watched her go. She felt a sense of peace. She didn't need Mrs. Sterling's approval anymore. She had the approval of the room, of her parents, and of herself. The walk home that night was different from other nights. The streetlights seemed to glow brighter. The air smelled sweeter. Anya's parents held her hands, swinging them between them as they walked. They talked excitedly about the future, about the phone call they would make on Monday, about the new doors that had opened. When they finally got to their small apartment building, Anya ran up the stairs. She didn't feel tired anymore. She went straight to the living room and turned on the lamp next to the old battered upright piano. It looked dusty and ordinary in the dim light, but to Anya, it looked beautiful. She sat down on the bench. It was worn and lumpy, much less comfortable than the leather bench on stage. But as she placed her hands on the chipped keys, she smiled. She knew now that it didn't matter what the piano looked like, or what she was wearing, or what anyone else thought. The magic wasn't in the expensive hall or the shiny grand piano. The magic was in her fingers and in her heart. Anya pressed down on a key, playing a single, clear note. It rang out in the quiet apartment, full of promise and hope. It was just the beginning.